and welcome to episode 78 of our SAP on Azure Video Podcast. Today is February 3rd, and together with Robert and Goran, we're here to talk about anything related to SAP and Microsoft. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
So today we are really happy to have Hans Reutter back on the podcast. Several months ago, he already joined us from Microsoft Digital, talking about the experience, how Microsoft runs SAP internally. And actually, Hans has been working with Microsoft or at Microsoft for over 25 years. So we thought, it could be very interesting that he not only talks about what we're doing today with SAP on Microsoft or SAP on Azure, but actually looking back at some of the fascinating things that actually make up this history between SAP and Microsoft. And I mean, some of you probably know SAP is celebrating their 50th anniversary already. So they were founded 50 years ago, or almost, I think, on April 1st, and they were founded. And it's just amazing how long Microsoft has been part of this journey. And I think Hans will definitely be able to share some very interesting insights with us there. But as always, before we hand over to Hans, let's quickly take a look at some of the news from this week. And we don't have a lot this week, but I wanted to start with a podcast that is called Security Unlocked, where two colleagues from Microsoft Security, Nick Fillingham and Natalie Gordelia, they're talking about some security-specific things that they come across in the Microsoft ecosystem. And this week was the first one, they talked about the Microsoft Digital Defense Report. And actually, this report is a fairly long report. I think we briefly also mentioned it on the show some time back. And now they are really going chapter by chapter through this report. And it's a really interesting take. For example, now they talked about ransomware, how a lot of bad actors are now able to easily get access to deploying ransomware at customers, how there are some really high profile attackers that really take a closer look at what is their target. They know exactly what's going on. And in this first podcast episode, they're really taking a closer look at that. So I thought this was super interesting. I mean, it's not directly obviously related to SAP on Azure, but I think if we look at the customer base that runs an SAP system, on Azure, these are enterprises, and it looks like the ransomware attacks are more and more targeting also these the bigger companies. So if you have time or if you want to read it, you can just also download here an offline copy, and actually it's under aka.ms/MSDDR. I think that was MDDR. No, that was it. But I'll also put it obviously. I'll put also the link into the show notes. So it's a fairly long report here, but it's definitely worth looking through or listening to the podcast. Then, Robert, just before the show, you found this article here.
Yeah, I was today. I saw that article. I think it's not related to SAP, of course, but I mean it's always interesting to somehow find some environment where we can set up some lab environments for classroom trainings or virtual trainings, and it's all around Azure Lab Services, where I, for example, like administrator, can create lab service, and then teacher can set up the complete lab, defining the VMs types, and then student can define the students or send the link that students can self-enrollment. I think it's complete concept of somehow creating complete environment where we can somehow test something together with students. I find it very interesting, and I didn't know actually that we have something like that. Yeah, so I didn't read everything. Of course, I didn't test it, but I find it very interesting. So that we have something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I know that when you do workshop with partners or others, I know that you very often like to do a lot of things hands-on also with your participants, and I think that's that sounds like a good possibility to create these labs environments. And
Way to go. Exactly.
Perfect. Okay, then one last huge thing actually for I would say customers in Germany or specifically for the German government. Just today, SAP and Arvato, or actually let me switch over to the English version. SAP and Arvato or Arvato Systems announced a partnership to create a sovereign cloud platform for the public sector in Germany. So really dedicated for the public sector. They obviously have some high requirements on GDPR, and data should stay within Germany and these things. And although I think Microsoft Azure and also Microsoft 365 is addressing these concerns to a huge extent. I think we talked about the data stays in country, or the data is owned by the different entities and stuff like that. Still, I think this approach from SAP and Arvato is a very interesting one, where they are really providing this sovereign cloud platform. And obviously from a Microsoft perspective, it's also interesting because SAP and Arvato chose Microsoft Azure as the underlying platform with the related Microsoft services with Microsoft 365. There's also a quote from Satya somewhere in this document that stresses the importance, and that also indicates how important Germany is for Microsoft, and that when it comes to data protection, that Microsoft also really takes a closer look at working with Germany, working with the German governance on making sure that these best practices are not only then relevant for Germany, but they can also be adopted to other regions. So I thought it was a very interesting announcement, just came in this morning, and yeah, it will be interesting to see where this evolves.
Yeah, and actually I was just interested in what services will be offered. And apart from Microsoft 365, they're also telling industry-leading SAP business application and tools. Okay. So meaning it is really then as well an SAP in addition to 365, which makes sense, definitely, right? So that's really, yeah, unique.
No, but I think you're right. I mean that's exactly what we are seeing. Not only with government customers, obviously, but they are using SAP. They want to run SAP on Azure. They have Office 365, Microsoft 365, and then obviously it's also about the integration. We talked about integration several times already, and I think that just makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And it shows in a beautiful way how SAP partners and Microsoft are really working together for our customers. And that's my beautiful segue over to Hans. Hans can talk about this, I think, in a really fascinating way, because he has been working with SAP for a very, very long time. He has been working at Microsoft for a very long time. And I know you have some really fascinating stories that you can share with us. So Hans, maybe for those of you, for those of the listeners who have not seen the previous episode, or who might not know you, maybe you can quickly introduce yourself, and then I'm really looking forward to the journey that you're going to take us.
Great, thanks, Holger. So yeah, my name is Hans Reutter. I'm originally from Germany, right, with the name Hans, but landed in the US after studying here, and then worked as an SAP consultant for a while before I got hired by Microsoft as an ABAP developer, and that was in very early 1997. And this is so think back 1997, right? This is when SAP was primarily running on Oracle and DB2 and Unix operating systems, and Microsoft had come to an agreement with SAP in the early 90s. This is Hasso Plattner and Bill Gates at the time, to port SAP and make SAP run on Windows and SQL Server. And so there were kind of two thoughts. One was we wanted to run the company Microsoft on a modern ERP, right? Because at that point it was mostly like homegrown, and people started to see this Y2K thing on the horizon, and so there was just this push to get to like a standard best in the industry type software, which is SAP ERP. And at the same time, there was this idea, if we can prove that SAP runs fine on the Windows stack and on the SQL Server stack, it really shows our commitment to enterprise software. And so, yeah, that's what happened. The SAP installation went live in 1996. And just for those people who are familiar with the SQL history, that was on SQL 6.0. So those were some rough days. So I started as an ABAP developer, and I remember having to put a lot of like SQL hints directly into the ABAP code. And then, later, obviously, SQL Server matured and became just totally awesome. But, back in those early days, there were some challenges, right?
I think SQL 6.0 and 6.5 are still code base for Sybase. We developed it together with Sybase, and then with 7.0 we switched to our code base. I think something like that. Yeah.
Yep.
And it was obviously not certified yet, right? I mean, this was a new database. This was the very first time that SAP was then running on SQL.
Right, and at the same time we were running our financials, right? Financials went first. So these were real live production systems, and we were, we had to close the books every month, every quarter. And so, but I think it set a good precedence for Microsoft IT, as it was called at the time. Today it's Microsoft Digital. So Microsoft IT being kind of the first and best customer for the product groups. And people in the past, people have used that term, eating your own dog food, which doesn't translate too well into other languages. But, being first and best customer really means we can give direct feedback to the product groups, right? Like what do we like, what functionality is missing, what would make our job easier. And at the same time, we also, see any kind of issues. And the idea is that, if there's any problems, we get it first. And by the time it then releases to customers outside of Microsoft, they know that it's not just gone through internal, like, software testing, but really productive use type testing. And they get the best quality possible.
I remember Microsoft would be actually the first one to run on non-RTM version of SQL Server.
Yep.
Productively. Yep.
Correct.
Productively. That's a difference. Yeah. Okay. So. Okay.
Yeah, and I heard that then this really became a bar. So that you had to make sure that SQL runs with SAP with all the tests, and that really improved the quality of SQL Server as well, because apparently a lot of issues were also found by running SQL with SAP, because obviously SAP has a certain workload, it has a certain performance that is required, and my understanding was that a lot of features went then also into SQL.
Right, and I mean, we all know SAP is pretty demanding, right, for the operating system, especially for the database, the underlying database. And so, yeah, we usually did like baseline testing on the old version, with full production load, and we would do like stress testing and all of those things, and then build a version with the new new SQL 6.5 or SQL 6 7.0 or whatever. And then compare, and then we would go live in our productive system. And yeah, I think it really drove the quality of the product. And we became sign-off criteria for the SQL product group. So Jürgen Thomas, which I think people have seen on this podcast a few times, he was our main partner, and there were a few others, Maria Balsamo and a few more. But they made a sign-off criteria, and that, I think, established a great relationship between kind of that internal SAP IT team at Microsoft, and then the SQL, and then later Azure, of course, product group. And then at some point also SAP IT joined as well, because as everybody knows, right, they've moved to Azure and they've done a lot of things there. So it's kind of that group of three that's now pushing for product improvements.
That's this sign-off criteria. That's really something that's really amazing. I mean, on the one hand, it shows how demanding an SAP system is, that you can really test your database. But I think it also shows how important this, even at that point, this combination of SAP and Microsoft really was. That you have a sign-off criteria with a third-party tool, so to say, I mean, an SAP system for an internal product. Well, not an internal product, but a product that you are developing. So I think that's a very high bar that you say no. SQL needs to pass SAP. Only then are we releasing it.
Right. And I can tell you, so some of the SQL versions that we got, things were sometimes pretty rough. And looking at some of the stats, a huge percentage of the overall bugs or issues filed came from the internal SAP team, which is great. But again, I think it served its purpose, right? First and best customer, flush out all the issues, and we're not just talking bugs, but also like usability and missing features or nice to have things that make life easier for IT, right? And so that went back into the product, and the partnership was super strong. I mean, I think it really helped out ultimately the end customers that got a better, more mature product, right?
Mm. I mean, we actually see that's exactly what we see even still today. I mean, a lot of things that go into Azure, especially for Azure on SAP, come from Microsoft Digital. So it's really fun.
I mean, also, if you take a look at our best practices, all those documentation around SAP is coming from actually very same team, because they actually, what they learn, they are transferring together with us and other colleagues to some best practices documentations. And this is, I think, the huge value for when we are talking about SAP on Azure, because we have a really strong internal knowledge, and we are really successfully transferring that to best practices, which partners and customers can.
Yeah, and interesting that in the last previous session you were talking, Hans, about actually how Microsoft IT is running both SQL Server and HANA as well. So both worlds successfully, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and on very, very large, with very large systems. And as you guys know, right, we've been on the cloud for 4 years now, 100%. So we basically repeated the same thing with Azure that we did with SQL, right? First and best. And usually, I mean, I would not recommend that when a company first starts dabbling and experimenting with Azure, don't move your SAP system as the first thing, right? Start with something smaller. But Microsoft IT, our CIO at the time, Jim Dubois, made the conscious decision, go with SAP and let's test it and see how good Azure is, and if there's any gaps. And I think it drove a lot of improvements, and obviously then also clearly showed that Azure was ready.
Mm-hmm. Wasn't that actually in February? Wasn't there in February 2018? Wasn't there? I thought I don't know. Was this the first? No, it was not the first system, or was it? Or the last system? I don't remember. That was migrated to SAP on Azure.
February 18.
Yeah. The
amazing.
Last systems moved February 2018, early, like I think it was February 13th or whatever that Friday was. That was the last one. So some systems much longer than 4 years.
Yeah. So since 4 years completely with SAP on Azure.
100%.
Amazing. That's really amazing.
Yeah.
So and February 18th, someone went in all data center and just switched off everything, because everything is now in Azure.
No, we didn't switch it off, right? Since these are production systems, we kept on-premise systems. For a few months, we closed. We did then our annual financial close in the cloud, and then we started taking away those backup systems on-premise. Now, of course, we had high availability and disaster recovery in the cloud, right? We're not reckless. We're first and best customers, but we're not reckless.
Of course.
But I have to say, I mean, some of us who are working with the customers have really this luxury to have Hans and the whole MS-IT to pull them into customer discussion, because they were requesting us, okay, give us some customer who's already running and who is better than the Microsoft IT as well. And some of them, they really love it and got encouragement to go for it. And that was really, I mean, this is the luxury what we here in Microsoft are having to, because it's not always easy to get some reference customers, so to say, and who do it. So that was really a great help and leading by the example, so to say.
Yeah,
And I remember you never faked anything or never talked nicely.
Exactly.
You said, okay, you had the issues, okay, we overcome, but this is the fact. And it gave them really those customer really confidence to go for it.
Good or bad, right? I mean, it's IT. We'll just tell it how it is.
And not only since we are running SAP on Azure, I think even before that, Microsoft Digital was a partner or a friend that a lot of customers reached out to ask them, because I still remember, I think one of the first presentations that I also saw from you where you talked about the high availability setup that Microsoft even had on premises, and the fire drills or the practice runs that you had, I think once or twice a year, where you would really do, and I think this is something that is really important, where you do a failover, where you run it for, I don't know, a week or something like that, and then fail back. I think that really impressed me, because a lot of customers are just setting up disaster recovery, and it's working, but they are not doing drills. They are not testing this. And I still remember when you were saying then, well, we do this, I don't know, once or twice a year, and we really run it on the other side. We see it, everything's working, and then we switch back. And that's, I'm not sure if there was any time a real failover, but I guess you would have been ready.
That's right. So we've never had to actually do it in real. And keep in mind, we have local high availability too, right? Yep. So if anything happens, that would always be the first thing. It's, I think disaster recovery doesn't count for anything unless you test it and validate it. It's all great in theory, and you hear horror stories from customers that thought they had it in place and are good to go, and then disaster strikes and they were not good to go. We have this awesome basis team. They exercise our disaster recovery once a year, and then they fail over, run there for a few days, and then fail back. And now to keep in mind, right, like when we do this, there is end customer impact, right? There will be a brief downtime. The business, on the one hand, doesn't like that. On the other hand, every time you hear in the news that so-and-so got hit with ransomware, or some major fire or disaster, whatever, took down some company for hours or days, they know, or they can be assured that this is not going to happen with us. We'll just switch over to our DR region, and Azure makes it so easy, right? With all these regions, you can pick a region that's close but not too close, right? So you kind of want to be a little separated. So Azure has all these options there, and that made it super easy for us. On-premise, it was a little harder, but that's one of the nice things about the cloud. Got all these different regions that you can go to. So
just select something, deploy it there. Yeah.
So
great.
Couple other things really call those out. So one of the early features that SQL really brought was SQL mirroring. That was back in 2004. And that's, if I remember correctly, that's actually a feature where we pushed back and there had to be some changes made. Again, with Jürgen Thomas, who you've seen on this podcast before. And then, of course, then with SQL 2012, we did Always On in 2012. So kind of the mirroring at the next level. Database compression, which saved us a huge amount of money. And these days, that's kind of default. But, back then, of course, that was new. And both at the row level and then at the page level with Unicode, and that was in 2010. And I do remember us going, to our hardware guys and saying, hey, actually, for the first time ever, we're going to shrink our SANs, and that was something they were not used to. Usually we kept coming and asking for more space, and so now we're like, oh, we can give all this space back. And then of course, go ahead.
Sorry, because the compression is quite impressive, right? I think I remember one of the slides where you said, well, we have a 16 terabyte compressed SQL server at some point in time, but uncompressed it was like 60 or 80 or something like that.
I think the last numbers I saw a few weeks ago was about 65, 66 terabytes uncompressed, but then on the disk it's about 23, 24 terabytes compressed. So maybe not quite down to third, but I mean it's a good ratio. And keep in mind that's in production, in your DR side, on your test systems where we also have a primary and a secondary, and then any kind of other test systems all the way down to your sandboxes. So times 8, 9, 10, whatever savings you have. So
quite some storage, yes.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and storage is expensive, so
that's right, especially the good stuff. Yeah, and then of course, once we move to Azure, there's all these new capabilities. So Goran and Robert, you mentioned earlier, right, that there's all this collateral out on the Microsoft side, white papers and things like that. And if people look for it, there's one on Azure Sentinel, there's one on Azure Monitor, how we're using that internally for SAP. So we did Monitor in 2019, we did Sentinel last year. And that's actually one of the things that we're also going to keep focusing on going forward, or the basis team is going to keep focusing on that. And then the other thing that's really happened over the last few years is lots of S4. So we have a large ERP system now on S4, and it's growing rapidly. And then we still have NetWeaver systems, so it's kind of a mix. I'd say maybe 40% S4, 60% NetWeaver. But I think you'll see that changing rapidly over this year, and then going forward.
But I think that's also one thing that I think makes Microsoft Digital so interesting for other customers to talk to, because you're not starting fresh. Microsoft is not a company that just started now with SAP, so we start fresh with S4, or we only have SaaS solution or anything. But I think if you look at a majority of SAP customers, they have been customers of SAP for 10, 20 years or something like that. So there's a huge installed base, and these customers are facing the very same challenges as what Microsoft is facing. So what about cloud? Should I go to the cloud? If I go to the cloud, well, what about S4? What do I do with my S4 installation? How do I migrate this? Do I do a lift and shift? Do I do a conversion or something like that? And I think that's why I think you interacted with thousands of customers, you alone, where you helped customers to explain, well, what is the journey from your current on-premises environment with ECC to Azure, to S/4HANA on Azure? What are the best practices? What are the lessons learned? What went well? What didn't went well? So I think that is something that is so valuable for our customers, that they really can talk to someone that went through the very same experience. And I actually think that the story will continue now. I mean, having 4 years experience of running SAP on Azure, there are also a lot of lessons learned. I'm sure some of the paradigms that we started with in 2018 are completely wrong in the meantime. And there are new things, better things that we're doing now that we have this 4-year experience of running SAP on Azure.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think we're constantly learning new things, and it's and just to be clear, what you said, the paradigm shift, I definitely think that's true. Especially as we're going from NetWeaver to S4, it's very different. A lot of things that we were used to, like, hey, we're just running it on Windows. Now we have HANA on Linux, in our case, SUSE Linux, but I think that's very different. Obviously, we are also running some SAP SaaS items like Concur and Ariba IBP, and how do you connect that back, and how do you monitor these things? Where can Azure help with that? How do you visualize maybe some of those data streams? in dashboards with Power BI and lots of other Azure capabilities. And so there is a very strong basis team here in Redmond. We have one in India as well, and these are people that love to talk to customers, and frankly, a lot of times we're learning something from customers as well. Is there maybe an aspect that we didn't think about? It's not a one-way street, so it's usually a very mutually beneficial exchange. And so yeah, these guys love to talk to customers, and obviously, I don't know if people have heard the name Elke Bregler before. She's one of the main presenters. We have Frederick, we have Eric Halling, and Sanoop and DJ, and all these just awesome people that love to connect with customers and then share information and also learn new things as well.
Yeah, I remember during that customer call, I was explaining how initially she was totally against the Azure.
Oh, yes.
But actually then later she changed the mind, and saw the benefit. Okay.
Healthy skepticism is a good thing, right? She wanted to see the data. She wanted to see the proof.
Yeah, true.
This story, and actually I didn't know that, but I think that I'm sure this resonates so well with a lot of customers, where also certain people probably have a lot of objections in moving to the cloud. And then if they talk to someone like Elke, I think it's great to what concerns did you have and why don't you have them anymore? And so I think again, so many lessons learned that customers can get from our own experience here.
Yeah, agreed. I do think that this transparency of, hey, here are things that worked or didn't work, and here's how we solved them. I think that's very important, right? That customers hear sales presentations all day long. They're not interested in that. That doesn't really help them to move forward. And like connecting with an actual IT team that tells them how it is, right, straight up, and then hear the solutions and real world, applicability. I think that really helps. And again, there's lots of resources on Microsoft.com, right? If you look for it, we have this awesome blog, right? Running SAP on the Microsoft platform, which is just full of information. Obviously, this podcast, there's a few other podcasts, but there's so much information out there. And then also connect to the Microsoft digital team if you want more, in depth and more personalized.
Well, thank you.
Maybe one really quick thing. What's next?
Sure.
You guys know I'm actually retiring from Microsoft, but that's not a bad thing. So, like I said, we have this awesome team internally that love to connect to customers, and they're really great, and they'll continue to do this. They can also do that in a few languages like Spanish and French and German. So, that helps sometimes, right?
Yeah.
And and happy to connect on LinkedIn, and obviously we're staying closely connected with each other.
Yeah. And Hans, again, thank you so much. I mean, when I read your goodbye email, I felt really sad because honestly, I mean, when I first saw you, so I joined Microsoft almost 5 years ago, and I was lucky that in one of my first meetings or presentations, I saw you, and I was blown away. It was so fascinating to see the way how you presented, how you were also able to answer deep technical questions. It was just amazing, and I took so much away out of this session. And I can tell you, I repeated your session in my own words a lot of times, and I will continue to do that because it was really very inspiring, and it for me again, it was really a living proof of how the relationship between SAP and Microsoft is working. So for me, it was really, really sad to see your email, but then it was I was really happy that you said no, sure, I'll come to the podcast again. So thank you very much for that. Maybe one last question that I have. So if you look back at your 25 plus years at Microsoft, is there anything that you would say that stands out specifically in the area of SAP and Microsoft, where you're saying, oh, look, we had so much struggle with SQL Server, and then it was fantastic to see it work, or when you finally switched off the last system on-prem and everything was in Azure? Is there anything, or are there just too many things that you can think of? And we didn't prepare this question, so sorry for that. Just came into my mind.
Yeah, I think probably the thing that stands out the most is, this is somewhat anticlimactic, but what a non-event the Azure migration was.
Oh, okay.
Well, so a little bit of background. So our, Microsoft's fiscal year goes from July to June. So end of June is our fiscal year end close. That's where it's all hands on deck. Everybody's on high alert because, that's when it counts. And so originally we were going to move our big ERP, that's that 65 terabyte system. We were going to move that to Azure after the fiscal year end in August. But the migration of these final systems went so well, we decided, let's just move it in February, which was our other time window. And, we felt confident that we can do this. And our CIO at the time, and then, Kurt Delbene was like, yeah, okay, you guys know what you're doing, go for it. And was great, great support from everybody. And we moved. And then by the time the books closed at the end of June, nobody really, it was just a complete non-event. And obviously there were some emails and everybody was celebrating. But the fact that this was done on an ERP system that just a few months earlier had been sitting on premise and now was sitting in the cloud, and a few months earlier everybody was super nervous, it was a complete non-event. And I think that's that's due to two things. One, this kind of awesome basis team with really super deep expertise, but also the maturity of the Azure product, right? The product group listening to all the feedback and making sure that we got what we needed, and just really everybody pitching in. And I do think, it's ultimately a good story. It was way easier than we thought it was going to be. So
Cool.
As an IT person, you like, low noise levels and non-events, right? If it's silent and quiet, that's always a good thing.
Perfect.
Nobody would complain when everything works fine, right? It's interesting. We should change that.
You want things to be boring. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, great. Then Hans, really enjoy your time off. We will definitely stay in contact. I will ping you from time to time. Now that Microsoft has acquired Activision, or we are in the process, we will broaden our gaming experience, and maybe sometimes we'll get you back to Microsoft to work on the gaming part, because maybe this is, you also have you publish videos on YouTube as well. So I think they are very active in the retro gaming area. Right. I saw some really great videos there. So we will definitely see, or I hope we'll see more content there. So anyone who is interested also in that should also check out your profile on YouTube and subscribe. But we'll stay in contact, and I'm sure to have you on the show some other time again.
Happy to be back.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.